I mean, just describe how disastrous that would be for the American economy. How would people feel the impact?
Well, they'd have very, very high inflation. The value of their dollar would be worth less. Companies would probably be yanking out investment because they don't want to invest in a country where they cannot trust in the credibility of economic policy making.
Are there fears in America? I mean, at the moment the economy seems to be okay, but you do hear economists talk about this. Stagflation is something we haven't talked about since about the 70s. Lots of things from the 70s seem to be making a comeback. We've had France going to the IMF, people thinking we might have to. Yes, there are dangers of people doing things that we didn't think was possible this side of the disco revolution. I mean, is there a chance that stagflation could be back in America?
So I'm usually a bit of a hater when it comes to 70s comparisons because I think too many of people in our economic policy making and potentially even the media were around in the 70s, and it's basically their only playbook for how economics works. And I think history may, rhyme, but it rarely repeats. However, having said that, I think stagflation in the United States, because of this bigger issue of fiscal dominance, has to be a real possibility. Now, it's interesting because we're talking at a time where the Fed's probably going to cut interest rates in September, and they were probably going to do that anyway before of all of this kind of drama around Lisa Cook. And then the question becomes, how far do you cut interest rates? And then the other big question is, where is inflation going? So these are the two most important data points. And I think now everyone in financial markets and economists are going to be watching two things. Any signs that inflation is increasing in the United States. We haven't seen so much of it so far. The so-called tariff pass-through hasn't happened yet, but it's very likely to happen. And then whether the Fed just cuts once or maybe twice and then holds it there, or whether they go on a sustained period of monetary easing as data shows that inflation is rising. That's panic stations. That's when I think the bond market will react. That's when I think the currency market will react. They literally need to see this happen for them to respond. And I think the problem is by the time they respond, it could be too late. So Lisa Cook may have been gone. Her appointment may have been already announced. Jerome Powell, his term is going to come up in 2026. He may also choose to leave the governing board. He doesn't have to, so that's another seat. That gives Donald Trump 5 out of 7 members of the most important body of the Federal Reserve. They also have the appointment to pick other members of the Federal Reserve. So by the middle of next year, you could get a sense in which the institution has just become very politicized, almost by stealth overnight. And most of us were sort of worried, but not worried enough. And now we're in a world where he's got control of the Federal Reserve and all of his lackeys are in the Federal Reserve and they're just determined to cut interest rates because intellectually that's they think is the right thing to do. So yes, I think stagflation, for the first time seriously, we really should be thinking about this phenomenon because there is a huge question about whether US monetary policy is now truly independent.
Wow. If that starts to happen, I mean, just describe how disastrous that would be for the American economy. How would people feel the impact?
Well, they'd have very, very high inflation. The value of their dollar would be worth less. Companies would probably be yanking out investment because they don't want to invest in a country where they cannot trust in the credibility of economic policy making. I think you're probably going to end up in a world where Donald Trump is going to produce his own set of economic statistics because we know that he has problems with official statistics when they show him things he doesn't like. Then you'd probably have his favoured media organs reporting on said alternative facts. And Americans will probably find it really difficult to pass where responsibility lies, but they will be feeling cost of living pressures. Companies will be feeling cost of living pressures. The economy and the labour market, which has been relatively strong, like a lot of Americans have been staying in work, even if their wages haven't been rising in line often with prices, they have stayed in work. If you have a situation where there's such a cloud hanging over your ability to set the correct interest rates, then you do end up in a 1970s world. But I think it's worse. And the reason it's worse is because the Fed has also become that body that also underpins the global financial system, which was kind of true in the 70s, but just not as much as it's true now, where we have a world of financialized capitalism. And so how will lower interest rates just affect the US banking system or the so-called shadow banking system or private equity or venture capital? All of these financial linkages where the dollar is basically the most important asset that sort of undergirds the way the system works is important for Americans, but it's also going to be important for us.
Would we feel the impact here?
Well, let's say we get in a hypothetical world where there is a financial crisis outside the US economy, which involves a financial institution that made some bad bets, whatever. I went back to the 2008, 2009 example where the Fed was there to give something called swap lines, which is basically they sign an agreement with another country's central bank to give them cheap dollars to help stem their panic. This level of cooperation has effectively often brought the world economy back from the brink of disaster.
Yeah.
If you're in a world where Donald Trump says, you, Mexico, can't get a swap line because you're not investing enough in the United States, and I'm going to put tariffs on all your goods, and I don't like the look of your government, and I want you to invest more in defense spending, say it's Europe, that Donald Trump could have the power to tell the Federal Reserve that they cannot offer that lifeline to another country at a time of financial stress. And that's, I think, even more important than the monetary policy conversation, is if the Fed is being told that it cannot give, as I said, these sort of financial lifelines to countries that need them, then you basically sort of take out the world's policeman and you get into a much unruly, I think, darker, scarier environment where the rest of the world is going to have to work out how to run the financial system without the country that runs the financial system. Right, so the politicization of the Fed and all parts of economic policy making is really important for the rest of us because we just rely on them so much to often just do the right thing.
And Mehreen, that's always been the fear when we've expected America to be the financial policeman in order to make the markets work. The dollar is the reserve currency we all sort of rely on. Is this just another step in that no longer being the case?
Yeah, I think so. And it's about the erosion of any sense of independent checks and balances on executive power and on brazen, unaccountable executive power. And it's important diplomatically for the rest of us, as people in Europe are finding out with their conversations about defense spending and tariffs. It's important for Americans because they ultimately will have to bear the costs of an economy that could be in a slow-moving collapse. And it's important for the financial system, which is, we've just got City of London behind us, for Wall Street, because so many of our own assets, our mortgage prices, our house prices, I mean, we are connected to the financial system in ways we don't know, much more than just our bank accounts. And if there isn't that central actor, that hegemon that behaves in a relatively benevolent way, then we all have to try and find ways to work out a way to run the system without them. But the transition to that new world is also going to be incredibly painful. So it's almost hard to talk about what this would look like in some world, and because I'm sort of devising and imagining a world that
we've never had to think about.
We've never really had to think about. We take these things like the dollar swap lines or the ability to cut interest rates to support an economy when needed for granted. We've just taken these central bankers very much for granted, and especially the American ones. We've just trusted them implicitly. We trust their dollar. We trust our own currencies, which are based very much on theirs. And when that trust is being eroded, as it is in real time, then yeah, I mean, I find it hard to almost convey the gravity of the world that we could be in. But it just will entail, I think, a lot of pain for people who probably just won't understand why any of this is actually happening. It's hard for people to realize we could be in a world of so much financial stress because of the ideological whims of a very important person who happens to be the US president. So I think there will be a lot of soul searching. I think the way that we, report on these issues, the way that, how important it is for us to sort of understand why this is happening is going to be very important to communicate to people about, what potentially are the consequences of eroding an institution that you'd probably never heard of before today, which is the US Federal Reserve. But there we go.